Before we get started, I wanted to ask you a question, Kurt.
Okay, go ahead, Tim.
So George Floyd was killed right here in the city that we live in at 38th and Chicago on May 25th, not quite 3 months ago from the date that we're recording today. And I wanted to ask, in your view, have things changed? Is our world any different today than it was before May 25th?
I think in some aspects, the world has drastically changed. But then in many aspects, the world is exactly the same as it was before. I think the issues that George Floyd's killing brought up are large. They're systemic. They have lasted the test of time, and to expect that things are going to change overnight or because of one thing, it is, I think, to a certain degree, though, the straw that broke the camel's back. It has been piling up for so long, so much, that this was just that piece. And I think there's a different feel, and I hope that there's a different outcome based upon that different feel. But we do see some things, right? We see the city council in Minneapolis here really looking at this and actually going pretty far in kind of stating we're going to disband the police. Now that hasn't happened, and there's lots of political ramifications moving forward with that. But there's a memorial that's probably going to be permanent going on at 38th and Chicago. There's peaceful protests that are happening all of the time, every Sunday within the town. There's protests going around the country and around the world still to this day. So I think there's that. What about you?
Well, I feel like the media has kind of moved on. Like we're not really getting the headlines about change as much as we're still getting reminded occasionally George Floyd was killed in Minneapolis on May 25th. We hear that, but we don't really hear about what's changing in the world. And I'm concerned that in the world of what gets measured gets done, that we're not measuring it. That we're really not really paying enough attention, so to speak.
Yeah. So when you think about this, though, it may not be in the media, but things are happening, right? Just want to add, there have been peaceful protests in 2,000 cities in the United States and hundreds of peaceful protests outside the United States since George Floyd's murder. And his death sparked a movement that is truly global.
Yeah, I agree. And yet I'm concerned that this global movement may not be having a big enough effect on our policies or our social norms. I'm not sure that the behaviors that I see in the world are really reflecting a meaningful increase in the general concern for human rights.
Our guest today would probably agree with you. And this might be a good time to tell the listeners who we are. Okay. I'm Kurt Nelson, co-founder of Behavioral Grooves.
And I'm Tim Houlihan. And with Kurt, we publish Behavioral Grooves to share insights about behavioral science by delving into why we do what we do. And today's episode has a very social justice angle to that discussion.
It sure does, Tim. In this episode, we spoke with Nicole Fisher, who is the president of Health and Human Rights Strategies and is a regular contributor to Forbes magazine on social justice issues. And that's how we found her. We read her piece in Forbes about the psychology of protests, and we realized that we had to talk to her.
Yeah, thankfully, she was kind enough to speak with us, and we found Nicole to be a fascinating person. She earned her master's in public health from the University of Chicago and her PhD in public health from Chapel Hill, and she was even an economics fellow at George Mason University.
She's not an exactly underachiever.
No, definitely not. And on top of that, she's been committed to social justice and human rights with a special emphasis on mental and physical health for more than a decade.
Our conversation with Nicole covered a wide range of topics, but we thought she had some interesting ideas about how Americans are processing the pandemic, like how it mirrors the stages of grief and the way we filter and process communication based on our beliefs. She also shared a cool idea about peer permission as a new spin on peer pressure.
Now, she's also working with Chris Graves from Ogilvy on a project called No COVID, and we're just excited to hear what sorts of things come out of that group.
Right. Which has some, again, hopeful aspects as we're looking forward to the change of things that are coming out of all of these controversies that we're doing. It was a terrific conversation, and I'm glad we had the chance to speak with her. Now it's time to sit back and relax with a fresh take on public health and social justice and listen to our conversation with Nicole Fisher.
Nicole Fisher, welcome to Behavioral Grooves.
Thank you.
It's good to have you
I'm
here.
really excited to be here.
Oh, glad.
Great.
We're excited to have you here. Let's start with a little speed round. Kurt, you want to get started?
Sure. Would you rather learn a new instrument or a new language?
Language.
Okay.
I love languages.
Yeah. Okay. Would you rather have dinner with your favorite sports star or favorite musician?
Musician.
Good
Tim
call.
likes you a lot more right now. There you go. I just have to say that. All right. Which would you prefer to watch? A cowboy western movie or a samurai movie? You knew we were going to come here.
I know. Samurai movie. They're like westerns with swords.
Westerns with swords. I love it.
Okay. So last speed round question. In this time of social unrest, do you think that we're better off focusing on peer pressure or peer permission right now?
Oof. I'm going to say permission. And I think my rationale for that is my own bias of the last few days. I've been obsessively working with how to communicate with people who are just not behaving the way we want them to right now. And I've been really digging into, I even tweeted, I think yesterday, something like, you can't shame people into agreeing with you. And so the last couple of days, I think I've just really come to this place where I'm obsessing over how do you garner buy-in, use honey, right? So I think I'm going to, I think right now I'm going to lean towards permission. We're in a permission phase.
Yeah, so this idea came from Gene Denby and Shireen Meraji, right, from Code Switch. And that was the first time that I'd heard this idea of peer permission being used. Can you talk a little bit about your understanding of what the concept is?
Certainly. It was new to me as well. I was actually doing a podcast with NPR on Code Switch, as you mentioned. And how this originally came to be is they had posed a question about why now white people, about why, so much is going on in the world and people seem to care about issues that have been pervasive throughout American history. And yet all of a sudden now they're showing up and caring in new ways. And as we were having this conversation about people's behavior, they noticed a really interesting dichotomy that you just alluded to, which was there's peer pressure to be engaged in these social justice issues, but there's also this other dynamic of peer permission. And a lot of people were responding to them and saying they never felt like it was quite their place to say certain things or stand up for certain issues or, be vocal. And it wasn't so much peer pressure, it was permission. They finally felt like they could say whatever they wanted and be heard.
Yeah, that's interesting. You talked at the beginning about using honey as opposed to shaming. So how do people go about doing that? How do we, if we are in conversations with those folks who we are trying to influence to make our world a better place, whether that be around potentially wearing a mask, whether it's about social justice, whether it's about a variety of other things, what are some of the things, so as you're thinking about this, right, you said you've talked or thought about this, using honey versus shame. How do we do that?
Well, I think a lot of what this comes down to is respect and understanding. And unfortunately, we are in one of those phases in time, particularly as Americans, where I think there's not nearly enough grace given to people. And everything is escalated. Everything is divisive. Everything seems to be an either or at this point. And I think people have drawn their lines. They've planted their flags. They've gone to their respective corners. And we've come to a stalemate on a lot of issues, and people are just unwilling to negotiate. And when it comes to something like wearing a mask, it just absolutely frustrates and baffles those of us who work in public health, because it shouldn't be a political issue at all. It should just be a collective good issue. At the same time, there are people saying, it's a slippery slope. If this can be mandated, what's next? And I think there needs to be, like I said, more understanding, saying, I understand why you feel this way, presenting data that can be trusted, saying, I hear you, I understand why you feel this way. How do we come to some sort of compromise? Is it that you only do it in these, instances, but when you're in these other instances, I mean, in New York, we saw a lot of kids in parks were being thrown out. And it angered a lot of people, because then the next thing we know, we see people out in the streets, and that's okay. And that's sort of what a lot of people saw as mixed messaging, created a lot of anger. Whereas I think there's plenty of opportunity to say, well, now we've learned kids can be in parks. Outdoor spaces are actually quite safe. How far apart with masks? I think there just really needs to be open and honest discussions between people, as opposed to, if you don't do this, you're killing someone, you're a bad person. You put those definitive, awful, you're a bad person sort of things out, and you're going to get met with hostility and resistance every time.
Yeah.
Well, you have a great view of global issues. I mean, your PhD is in global public health. You spend a lot of time looking outside the U.S. Do you think some of these, this tribalism, this sort of digging in, is different in other countries? And because the pandemic is everywhere, it's not like it's just the U.S. So other countries are suffering too. Do you think it's different?
I think it is different. It's different in the same. So as you said, I have a doctorate in public health. Humans are inherently the same. What we're all going through has many similarities. How we are addressing it is very different. And there are a number of things I think at play. First and foremost, we're in an election year. We're a few months away. Lord help us all. Everything right now, the word I used earlier is escalated, right? Like everything is going to get escalated. And that's a unique factor. We're also very American. And you can ask anyone else in the world, and when they describe Americans, they describe us very differently, because we inherently are different. We view freedom differently. The other big factor I think that's at play, and this is something I've seen across many different countries, is different responses have been based on a number of factors, but trust in science, trust in the experts, trust in medicine, in the institutions, and a lot of places where you see a lack of trust in authority, which I would argue is very much what's happening here right now. There's much greater distance between what people are willing to do and believe and what's being printed in the media. It's night and day. Countries that seem to have a lot of faith in their leaders and or a lot of trust in researchers and scientists. We've also seen countries, I would argue, that put public health leaders out front at the very beginning, and have had consistent messages since February or March. They've done the best. Those that have gone back and forth have struggled. Now that said, most people don't ever have to watch science happen in real time, and it is very difficult. It is so difficult. And something that I will say is not uniquely American, but has really been brought, right in front of our faces, is this concept of fake news. And people are in a place where they're ingrained right now to think if it doesn't align with what they believe, or it belongs to a certain person or party, it's fake news. And with science, the more information you have, the more inputs you have, the better the output is going to be. And the more information you put in, the answer should change. In fact, if it doesn't, I would argue you've done something wrong.
Yeah.
You know? And so when we say one thing, but then someone says, hey, we've run 2 more randomized clinical trials, we're now finding this. Best practices should evolve. They should change. We should grow and learn. And the fake news sort of mentality being applied to science right now, I'm not seeing that in other places quite like I am in the US.
It's interesting. You talk about this trust in science, and I love the idea of watching science in real time, because I think that is a key component of this for people who don't fully grasp how science works. This idea that you have X amount of information and you're going out to find more information, and that may change your understanding based upon the new information that comes in, which may change the recommendations that are being brought out. And that's how science works. That's how it's supposed to work, as you said. And we get people, and you talk about this confirmation bias, right? That if it doesn't align with my pre-held beliefs, then it becomes fake news. And if I can grab onto this little piece of nugget, well, you said masks were bad at the beginning. You said that, and so now you're changing this, so now this is fake news. So I think there's a lot of human dynamics that are coming into play on this, and I think you've outlined this idea of people watching science happening in real time is just a new phenomena for many people, and I think that we need to do a better job at explaining and communicating that, and I just don't know how to do that.
Well, and that's one reason I think you're exactly right. And that's one reason I had said a moment ago, I think, and again, there are so many dynamics at play. It's impossible to say, here's the one thing that made the difference in this country or that country. But on trend, the countries that put the public health experts out front, I think have done the best. And I think part of that is because, again, the communication has been consistent, even if the recommendations change. But further, I would argue it's more common, perhaps, I'm not sure what the right word is here, but for people in, say, public health or in science to be a lot more honest and say, I don't know. Mm. And the amount of trust that is built when someone is authentic and they say, we don't know. This is a new virus. We don't know. We're all in, we're learning together. Whereas politicians, they sort of, their entire career is built on saying, I know, I can do this and this and this, and here's what's going to happen. You cannot do that in this situation and be honest. You're going to have to walk something back. You're going to have to change your recommendations. And so, countries that have come out strong with political opinions, I would argue, have greatly eroded the public's trust.
Yeah. I think the language that scientists and health professionals use just in general, maybe even not saying I don't know, but the data suggests this never really black and white. There's typically a gradient of gray somewhere in the speech and the language that we use.
That's a great point. And I tend to, even in my reading, if an article, even in mainstream media, if an article says suggests, that's a great word that you used, or may indicate, mm-hmm. I inherently trust that article, that author, that study more than these headlines that are so and so rips apart. This proves that all this, the language that's so often used right now, because it's clickbait material, right? I mean, it's got those strong, evoke so much emotion words are just being thrown around left and right. And when you read that, as someone who participates in science and public health, when you see that, you just, I don't know, at least for me, I immediately think, okay, well, this can't be true. And or they have exaggerated to the point that, all right, maybe a piece of this is true, but the rest of it's just fluff.
But in general, it does. Our human brains are much happier with the polar opposites. It's either yes or no. It's either black or white. It's much easier to deal with. It is this way or it is not this way. Not most of the time it's this way, or we're not really sure that it's this way, or the evidence suggests it's this way, that's more difficult. It takes more cognitive, horsepower to process that.
Of course. Yeah, I think that's exactly right. It's easy to say yes or no. It's easy to, well, earlier you talked about confirmation bias. It's easy to believe things that already tell us what we know. It's really hard to say, well, it can be both, or it depends, right? Then you add all these dynamics in that they make us tired. They use energy.
Well, and in a time when we're already emotionally drained with all the other stresses that are going on, with the economic potential, the health potential, all of those factors, it's one more thing on top of it. And so I think people gravitate to those yes, black, white kind of answers and say, yeah, all right, this is one thing I don't have to actually think about, because this messenger who I believe says it is so, or the messenger I don't believe says it is so, obviously it's not, so therefore I'll believe the opposite. Various different pieces of that. So
yeah, and I think what you pointed out is so important, that, and again, this gets back to sort of earlier we were talking about pressure versus permission, and shaming versus driving with honey. People are exhausted. People are emotionally, mentally, physically tapped out right now. And to be honest, at least here in the United States, between now and November, it's not going to change. In fact, I think it's going to get worse. And therefore, when we communicate with people, when we talk to them, you have to just immediately understand they're taxed. They're at the end. They're tapped out. They have a million frustrations, concerns, worries, and just like, earlier we were saying, the easy decisions, the black, white, yes, no, good, bad. Everyone, for the most part, is currently living in a situation where it's not work, home. It's not school, daycare. Everything is sort of in this ebb and flow and making it up every day. Monday looks like Thursday, looks like Saturday. We're in a really confusing place. People are just being pushed to their limits, and truthfully, we just don't do well when that's a pervasive state of being.
Right. I'd like to go back to the reason that we met is because you wrote a terrific piece in Forbes on the psychology of protests. And that really, it caught Kurt's and my attention. And we were wondering if we could talk a little bit about that. And maybe you could just do a quick summary for our listeners for sort of the thesis of the piece, if you wouldn't mind.
Sure. That was way back in March. So even I have to
that was like
think, what was March? When was March?
Yeah.
Basically, at that time, I was very curious. I had assumed, I guess we'll start, I'll be efficient, but, sort of ground you in the concept of, I assumed, much like the stages of grieving, we all go through these stages, they're at different times, but we sort of know the progression of how we, learn to grapple with these losses. I made the assumption that pandemics, because they're as old as mankind, there would be something similar. Like, here are the stages of pandemic. Here's what people go through. And that body of literature really doesn't exist. And so I started digging into the history of pandemics and what happens particularly when people are locked down. You can look to prison literature, you can look to juvenile justice literature, and we see psychologically patterns that arise when people have freedoms taken away. And so I just started, looking at all these parallels starting, I think about the 1400s, kind of where I drew the line, but to present. And it is remarkably similar what happens when we lock people in. A couple months in, when there's uncertainty, when there's lack of, again, earlier I said trust and authority, people start to share grievances. They start to share their fears, and those become amplified. They become more intense. Shared geography is a big piece of it. People are, who live near each other often have very similar sort of situations, backgrounds, troubles. And what happens? Well, usually there's an injustice that takes place. It could be that a political figure is removed from the quarantine zone. It could be a video of someone being killed. It could be a million different things, but it takes an injustice that really unites people. And it's like a tinderbox. It just blows up and people get angry and then they protest and they riot. And it's a pattern that just keeps playing out when pandemics arise.
Yeah. In your article, you also talk about this lack of trust in government or authority. Again, coming back to some of the other things that we've talked about. So again, the perfect storm basically was brewing before the George Floyd instance happened. Are you surprised at how long that this has been going on? Because obviously that was back right around Memorial Day, and yet there are still protests going on. You look at Portland, that's going on right now, a variety of other things that are still playing out. Are you surprised at the longevity of this?
I am. I'm also surprised by the growth. What I mean by that is this is not confined to a geographic area. We're saying like New York got locked down, New York goes crazy, or this incident happened in Minnesota. Minnesota's an anomaly. We're seeing protests literally all over the world. And so not only how long they've been going on, but how they've, inspired protests all over the world for injustices, mostly race-based. I think there's a couple interesting components at play there that make this different, maybe too strong of a word, but we live in a technologically advanced time when in the 1400s they couldn't tweet and share all over the world. But I think that the couple things that are, you're sort of unique here are, one, that ability to share information. A video can go viral in seconds. And secondarily, a key component to riots is anonymity. And it's one reason people don't want to take to the streets. If you can see their face, you know who they are, it can reflect on their employer, their family, all kinds of things can be tied to people seeing you misbehave. We are in this place where we're practically told to be anonymous. The police show up with riot gear, full masks, and civilians are told to wear masks, stay covered. And so I think particularly at night when the sun sets, it just becomes this perfect, as you said, it's a perfect storm. And then you add in the shared information and the ability to join a mass crowd and amplify the voices, amplify the anger, the intensity, but still remain anonymous. That's a pretty unique circumstance.
And possibly even slightly dehumanized with the amount of gear that the police are wearing. The riot gear almost puts them into sort of a RoboCop-like look. Some of them almost look like they're 22nd century kind of super characters, and less like people. And that could have a dehumanizing effect both for them as being under all this armor, as well as for the people who they're looking at, don't perceive them as people. And consequently, they're looking at the masks, the hordes of masked people like, well, they're not real people because I'm not really seeing their faces. Is that part of it too, do you think?
I would say for me, it's anecdotal, but visually, one thing that will stand out to me for the rest of my life is not only the riot gear, but that military type presence. Living in downtown DC, to have a good 48-hour window plus where the streets are lined with that RoboCop type looking figure, all black, riot gear plus military presence, police presence, the Humvees, it was a surreal feeling. I couldn't believe I was in an American city in 2020. And so, when people are out in the streets and they're already angry, I have no doubt that just visual presence alone completely changes the psychological aspect of what's happening and the gravity of it.
Yeah. It's really interesting. You do a lot of work in just your regular day about health issues. And in our conversation, we talked with you a little bit before this. You mentioned that social justice can be seen through a health lens as well. Can you talk a little bit about that in just why that might be something that is not only just a social justice, but there's some health component elements to that?
I would actually take a step even further back than that and say the way I view the world is health is everything.
Mm.
It is every single thing about you, starting from childhood development, everything you see, hear, touch, smell. I mean, your brain is changing in real time based on every experience, all the way through adulthood. Where you live matters. The people you interact with every day matters. The job you have, how you feel about it. I mean, public transportation is a public health issue. Whether someone takes, they walk a mile to work, they sit in a car for 2 hours, they ride public transportation. I mean, those kinds of things very much affect your mental health, your emotions, obviously your physical health. And so, the work I do, most often I would say we work in things like education, nutrition, water, some of those basic sort of human right access issues. But at the end of the day, I have no problem advocating for grocery stores in neighborhoods that don't have them. The exact same way I would advocate for, changes to public transportation. I mean, there are moms who have to take 3 buses to get to a hospital. And if you have a sick child, I mean, that could be the difference between life and death. And then when they say, hey, come back tomorrow, can you come back in a couple of days? That's 3 buses there, multiple hours, 3 buses home, multiple hours. She likely had to take off of work. Is she going to be able to do that again tomorrow or the next day? And so those are, at their core, a lot of social justice issues, how people are treated, where they live, what they have access to, and they're all health.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting part where you start thinking about this through a lens that really highlights how important all of those aspects are, not just to the economic viability, to everything else, but it parlays into how we are, as how healthy we are, over and above just those other inconveniences or the other aspects that it's dealing with. So really insightful.
Tell us a little bit about, you're working on a task force with one of our favorite Ogilvy employees, Chris Graves.
Everyone loves Chris.
Everybody who knows Ogilvy knows Rory, blah, blah, blah. That's great. But Chris Graves is really a great leader within the organization when it comes to behavioral science. And you're doing some work with him. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
So it's a fantastic group of humans. I am baffled they asked me to participate. It's called No COVID, and it's a very, very dynamic group of humans from all different kinds of backgrounds. We have John Barry, and we've got some incredible public health people, incredible data people, and as you said, Chris Graves and a couple other people from Ogilvy. And some of the things we're trying to do are communicate with those who perhaps haven't come along in the process of getting on board with the precautions for preventing spread of the virus. It could be we're not taking on issues like whether schools should reopen or not. For us, it's really about meeting people where they are, particularly in the most vulnerable counties, and then trying to communicate with them about the state of the real world, what they can do, what's in their control. And then, of course, those dictate, when we can sort of get back to norm. But it's been a really fun experience. I think for me, one of the greatest lessons learned is that in so many communities, you can have your big celebrity, Chris Rock, John Stamos, there are a couple of the names, people who've come on to, make a Twitter or YouTube video saying, hey, wear a mask, et cetera, et cetera. And they have an influence. People like them, they love them, they listen to them. And yet it's really those local community people that they trust. And so it's been really fascinating to see that in, some particular county, it could be the local high school basketball coach. Mm-hmm. It could be the used car salesman. It's the voice that they've heard, the face that they've seen, the person that they trust. And that is often the best communicator. And we've also, I think, done a really good job about finding some of the surprise communicators, people who have changed their tune. And that often can garner a lot of buy-in, because then people see someone change their mind. That's okay. Like, why did they change their mind? Is it because they have a family member who contracted the virus? Is it because, what is that experience? And so we're doing our best to really find the best voices and advocates in science and in public health and communications, and build a team.
Yeah. It reminds me a couple things. One is Christina Becchieri, who we interviewed, who does this fantastic research on social norms. And she talks about the influence. She goes, we think about social norms as these big, large norm things. And she said, really, they're reflective of the reference that we have, and that reference group is much smaller. And so it is that person who is that local basketball coach, the neighbor across the street, those people that are in our community that we hold as they're like us, they're part of our circle, and those are the people that we look to see what are the social norms that are acceptable and how we process them. So that makes sense. And this other part that you talked about, and now I just blew where I was going to go with the second part, number 2. So
I was loving the first part, I'll tell you that.
Me too. Yeah, I think you're 100% right.
Yeah, I think the other key piece of this, though, is thinking through when we are communicating. Right, you talked about this trust aspect and how that is so vital. Is how are we communicating to build that trust, right? What are the things that we are doing that enable the trust? And this is the second part where I was going to. You talked about those people who had changed their tunes, and we heard Robert Cialdini talk about this at a conference where he said, one of the best ways to influence somebody is to say, look, I was just like you, and now I'm thinking this way. Because immediately what that does is it lowers down that initial defense. And so those people who you go, oh, yeah, you're part of my tribe, and now you're saying this. So there's that aspect of change that I think is really vital in order to get people to realize, as you eloquently said, this is the real world. This isn't this make-believe world that I want to live in, but this is the real world, and these are the consequences of what's going on and what we need to do in order to combat those things.
Mm-hmm. So. And I really like what you said about, that localized quote-unquote influencer. And for whatever reason, as you said that, I'm not sure why pediatricians popped in my head. I was thinking to myself, but the academy can release recommendations, and people, will buy in to some extent to the experts. At the same time, if you have 2 children that are, 5 and 10, you're going to trust your pediatrician when they know you. They know where you live. They know your children. They know their histories. They know what school they go to. They know what's happening with other kids in the community. And so for a lot of people, okay, it's wonderful that, a collective group of smart people said, here's what we should do, X, Y, Z. But what your pediatrician tells you it carries so much more weight. That trust is there. Trust is hard to build. And so people are going to look to that localized group of trusted voices.
Well, in some ways, it almost sounds a little bit like there's a little bit of peer permission going on, that when we have a reference group that says it's okay to feel this way, we've got a little bit of permission going on there, as opposed, it's back to the honey thing, right? Coming kind of full circle on this.
That was very well done. I'm really, that was very well done.
Even
it's not your first day. It's not your first day. But I think you're right. And actually, that is a remarkable way to bring it back. It tells people, yes, you might have taken a stance. Yes, you might have thought this, but you now see someone else learning. I think it'll be very, I'll use the word interesting, because I'm not sure exactly what word to put there. But I'm looking forward to seeing what happens now that the president has worn a mask and said that we should. Some people would argue it should have happened months ago, but we have seen that to me is the biggest sort of shift for a group, a whole cohort of people that said it wasn't masculine, they didn't believe the science, and he did a complete about face and now says there's science to support this. So I'm really interested to see what impact that will have. Is it too late? Have too many people planted their flag and refused to budge? Or is that exactly the permission they needed to move down that gradient? How much, I don't know, but we'll see.
Yeah, I'm interested as well. How anchored in are people in this belief that was preset before, and now that shift? Can they, as you said, plant their flag? Can they lift that flag up and move it over to the next spot? Because I'm not sure. It'll be interesting to see over the next month, 2 months, what happens with some of that.
It will be, and I think in that same time frame, there's going to be a lot of moving parts, right? We're seeing numbers in places like Brazil and Argentina that are very troubling. It's their winter. It's hot as hell right now here in the States.
Yeah.
But we've only got a couple months left of this, right? We're going to enjoy our summer. We're going to be out doing whatever it is we choose to do. But then we're going to start going into fall and into winter. And whatever's happening down there, just like the flu, there's a decent likelihood it's going to move right back up here. So I think in that same window of time, we're also going to see kids going back to school. We're going to see more people heading back to work. There's a lot of moving parts in the next couple months, and I think there's so much that's up in the air. We're certainly not out of the woods.
No. Kurt, do you have I was going to make a move here.
I thought you were going to go to music.
You got it. We are so televised.
I was thinking this is the time that Tim always brings up music, and I'm, 160 some episodes, and I'm starting to get it. Starting to learn.
Nicole, these are unprecedented times. My gosh, how many times have we heard that, right? But I'm wondering how these unprecedented times have impacted your music listening. Do you have a pandemic playlist? Is there a new approach that you're taking to your interaction with music?
I'm listening to more music, but I'm also listening to, there are two pathways here. The first is I'm listening to old music. I don't know what that says. I tend to go through phases anyway, which I recognize. I was born in Louisiana and then grew up in Missouri. So there's a lot of country, like old, like my grandma's country mixed in there. But then, running, I have all this like super upbeat, Beyonce type thing. And I have found myself sort of going back to like old country. And I have absolutely no idea what that says about me. But the other path is and I apologize to you up front for even saying this on a podcast. I just discovered podcasts.
Oh!
It's wild. There's a whole world out there, and it's awesome. Right? And it's so embarrassing. I know some people have been into them for years, and I'm even opening some, especially the true crime type.
Uh-huh.
And I'm scrolling back to like 2016, and I'm like, where have I been? I guess in books. I don't know. But I have been loving the ability to just spend 30 minutes to 60 minutes and just get lost in a story. I even went so far as I did there's the true crime. I think everyone kind of loves that stuff. I did a stint in cults, but again, I'm fascinated by my background's in neuroscience. I'm just fascinated in the brain and human behavior and development of people. Cult leaders are a really interesting group of people to study. But then there's this other subset of things I've been listening to that are things I feel like I should have learned. So I've been doing Greek mythology.
Wow.
That's wild.
All right.
I'm actually embarrassed to tell you. I didn't know. I mean, I knew who like Zeus was. That's it. Maybe Hera.
So what podcast?
They make us look so tame.
So what podcast is about Greek mythology? We need to do a shout out for our listeners in case I might actually be interested in listening to some Greek mythology.
If you're into humor, the one I would recommend is called Misunderstood.
Misunderstood.
It's Misunderstood. It's a guy and a girl, and there's a whole second sort of maybe season in which they get into Thor and Loki and all the Norse mythology. I have not gotten on board with that as much, but the first probably 30 whatever episodes are Greek mythology, and it's this guy who knows this forwards, backwards. He travels a lot with his family, and his best friend, who's a comedian in, I think, LA, and she has she can't pronounce any of the words. And he'll say, and it's just like how some of the gods are made. I didn't know. And she'll be like, time out. So what you're really saying, and I had no idea how vulgar and violent, and hearing someone just not know anything, it's like she asks all the questions you want to ask, and she calls like bullshit like all the times you want to go, wait, this is not how it works. For me, it's been a very nice balance of laughing a lot, and I remember it because it's relatable.
Yeah.
So, and it actually got me to buy multiple. I went to a really great bookstore in DC, Second Story, and I ended up buying a ton of old editions of Greek mythology and started reading it.
Oh, cool. Very cool.
Yeah.
It's amazing. It's amazing, like podcasts, because to that degree, there's so many different worlds out there, from, you said, true crime to Greek mythology to revisionist history to all those things that you can lose yourself in, and I think they're really wonderful. And to that degree, some are more humorous, some are more serious, but you find the ones that you like, and you can learn a lot in your half-hour run, commute, getting ready for bed routine, whatever that would be. So
exactly. Yeah, it has been it's been a really fun listening experience. And as you just said, I often take books with me. I still love books, but it's so easy to pop in an AirPod and go do whatever it is you're already doing, and you're laughing along the way. And if you miss something, you realize you've spaced out, you can just hit back a little bit, hear it again, you can save it. I feel silly. Welcome to 2020. Podcasts are a thing, and I like them.
Oh, that's awesome.
Well, Nicole Fisher, welcome to 2020 and all the wonderful technology.
Can I go back?
Yeah, welcome to 2015.
Yeah.
Yeah, welcome to 20.
I don't want to be in 2020.
Yeah, 2015.
I actually just bought t-shirt. It says 2020. It has 1 star on it, and it says like, very bad, do not recommend. I saw it, and it was, one of those silly, like Etsy, like $15 t-shirts. And it's like the only thing I've purchased lately, but I laughed so hard. I was like, I feel as though I can be 80 years old, and if I wear a t-shirt that says 2020, do not recommend. Like, people will just get it. Like, yeah,
people will understand.
Yeah.
we do not recommend that one.
Yep.
Generations of people living today will, for a long time, have memories of 2020.
Very strong ones. And to that degree, they would not recommend it either. So there you go.
1 star. I would give it 0 if I could.
So thank you so much, Nicole, for your time. It's really been a pleasure having you as a guest today. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. And of all podcasts, I love yours. It also is funny and you learn. And there's nothing more fascinating than people. And so to have a space where you talk to people about people is just, it's brilliant, it's clever, and it's like so simple because we're goofy.
Well, Tim is definitely goofy. I'm a little bit goofy, but yes, no, people in general, we're goofy. We are goofy. I love that. So, Nicole, thank you.
Thank you.
Hey Groovers, welcome to our grooving session where Tim and I groove on what we learned from our conversation with Nicole, have a free-flowing discussion, and talk about whatever else comes into our public health informed brains. How about that, Tim?
That was beautifully done.
No, the public informed health brains. What about that? Not how good I can read words on the page.
Well, both are good. How about that? Both are.
Oh, okay. All right. We'll go with that.
Because I'm not going to dish, because you did a fabulous job of reading, but you also teed up public health informed brains, which is so deeply underappreciated right now. Like what we're going through right now with the pandemic, it's a public health problem. Period. Yes. It's a public health problem, and yet it has become a politicized thing. It's become this big political football that just seems ridiculous in some ways, the way that we politicize it. I'm sorry, I'm just ranting.
Which is what we do in these grooving sessions. We rant based on the things that we talked about, right? So Nicole brought up this idea that really it is a public health issue, and for whatever reason within the U.S., it's become this highly divisive political aspect, just like you said, political football back and forth. And we tend to think about this, I think, as this way of which team am I on, right? As opposed to saying we're all on the same damn team. And this is the same damn team, not just in the U.S. We are on the same damn team in the entire world, right? Because it's a pandemic, and if we're thinking about who's the opposite team, it's COVID-19 and the coronavirus. It is not Republicans and Democrats. It is not the U.S. versus China or Europe or whoever it would be. It is humans versus a virus.
Yeah.
All right.
It's that simple. It is really that simple. It's humans versus the virus. That's great. Maybe that should be the title for our episode.
Well, there we go.
Well, let me say, can we start talking a little bit about her beautiful description about needing grace and understanding versus more judgment?
Oh yeah.
So this whole idea of Americans are really good at escalating issues, and we live in this time, right? Which is, we've got Twitter, we've got access to so much more content, so much faster. We can get our opinions out there in lightning speed. And it's
to a much broader audience than we used to in the past, right? Our own opinions now get magnified because we have this technology in front of us that allows us to go and pontificate. And it's not just to the 3 people that are walking by as we're standing on our soapbox, but it could be to tens or hundreds or thousands of people who are connected to us via social media.
And it doesn't help when we're watching, as she said, I love this, watching science happen in real time.
Ah, love that. It was the piece that I just got goosebumps when she said that, because I think I think the general population, and again, I might be just misconstrued on this. This is just me talking about my own personal beliefs. Is that I don't really think that the general public understands how science really works, at least not at that core level. And this idea that science finds the answers and the answers are solid and that's just how it is. And that's not science. Science is this continual exploration. It is this skepticism about even the things that we really think are true and believe. We want to make sure that we fully understand all of the components of, when is this really true? Is this true in all situations, all contexts, in these different things? And the science around this virus has been very fascinating to watch, because you see it happening. You see, again, it was brand new. It's called the novel coronavirus for a reason. It's novel. It's new, and understanding it. We look at our past history, and we look back at the last situation that has any parallel, and yet it's not like that. So we draw inferences there, then we test those hypotheses, and we get some results. But then on further analysis and broader scale, that changes and shifts. And so the messaging around this has to change and shift, which for people who think of science as this, nope, it's one right answer, or this is how it is, then you lose trust, right? You lose that trust in the science. And that's actually, for me, it's saying, oh, we need to trust the science more because they're actually getting to the right answer.
But it's messy. The trouble is that when I don't know would actually be a really great answer, that is not what the masses like to hear, nor is it the kinds of things that politicians want to say.
Yeah.
Politician none of them want to stand up and say, I don't know. That's not a position of power. They want to be I know, this is what you do, this is how to do it, and just be very directive. And we as citizens, we want to hear that. It's much easier to respond to just do this than we're going to have to figure this out as we go.
Well, we crave certainty, right? This ambiguity, this unknown is troubling for us, which lends itself then into confirmation bias, right? This idea that confirmation bias thrives in these ambiguous situations, and I am going to, this is new and different things. So I'm going to believe the information that is out there that confirms some pre-held beliefs that I have. That way I don't have to think about it as hard, and it's easier. And there's not this because we do have information coming at us very quickly that may be disparate, that might be contradictory in some instances. And to go in and really explore and to test all of the opinions and the messaging that are out there is just exhausting.
It is. It is exhausting. It also, I want to pull it back to the sort of the grace and understanding part. And this may be a little off, certainly not traditional to what we talk about.
You are, welcome to your off days, man.
Well, so I had all these years of Catholic education, and the prayer of St. Francis rings in my head about trying not to focus so much on being understood, but to rather focus on understanding. And I feel like we're not doing that. This is a really good time for all of us to do that. And I don't mean all of us as a code word for people that don't agree with me. I actually mean all of us, that we do a better job of really trying to understand where people are coming from.
So you mean I have to do this too? It's not the code word for those others that are out there. I have to try to understand.
Yeah. I think that you could. And I could absolutely take more time and invest more in trying to understand where other people are coming from.
And again, I think about this whole COVID thing, and we've talked to a lot of people about this. And Brad Shuck keeps coming up in my mind when we think about this, and particularly as we talk about grace, because he brings up this grace thing, and he's talking about it from this work perspective, that we need to have more grace with the people that we're working with, and understand that, hey, we don't know fully what is going on in their life. And so to expect them to show up to work the same way that they did prior to this pandemic is a little foolhardy. It's a little bit of this idea of putting blinders on and just la 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 la, the ostrich. What is the ostrich effect, right? Put your head in the sand and just hope things go away, right? And that's not the case. And to have this grace, this idea that we need to offer people a little bit of forgiveness and a little bit of leeway in how they're responding, and to your point, trying to understand them even to that degree, at not just that surface level, but understand what's really going on with them, I think is really key in this time.
Yeah. So what else, Kurt? What else?
Peer pressure, which we've all known about ever since, junior high and high school, right? We've known about peer pressure, but have we heard about peer permission? Yeah. I love this concept. And granted, Nicole said she stole it, but this idea of peer permission, I think, is really interesting to explore, right? This, pressure is that the idea that we bend to a social norm. And permission is saying it's okay to question those social norms, which, by the way, you kind of outlined, which I appreciate. You're the one who brought that up, but I'm taking it because it's awesome.
It works because it totally works, right? So we have this opportunity now to really think about the world differently with peer permission. To say, I am elevated in the position that I have to actually feel like, oh, I can do something about this. And I love that empowering nature to it, and found something that, gosh, if we could actually, if white people's reference networks were actually to give them permission to dig into racism, like, that would be really cool. That would be a really great thing to just feel like, oh, I have permission to do this, rather than pressure. I think that's a fabulous thing. What does she call it? The honey versus the shame thing.
Yeah. I love, and again, I think it was Brad Shuck again who talked about, you attract more with honey than you do, whatever that statement is. I don't remember. But yes, I think there are some really interesting pieces of a permission piece where it's permissible to question our beliefs, which is hard. And if we have the reference network that says it's okay, that we can question our group's long held beliefs, or maybe not even beliefs, this maybe lack of beliefs that we have, this lack of actual inquiry into the world of what it's really like to be a Black person in the United States. And we just gloss over those things because we look at our own experience and say, well, their experience must be similar. And that's not necessarily the case. And we have permission to explore those things now, which I think is good.
I was born into a world where I'm pretty sure that all the doctors and all the nurses were white. I'm all the doctors that I saw throughout my childhood were white. In fact, I had one primary physician who was, a man, even a white man. So doctors were white men. Everything got reinforced in that world. And so it's hard to break out of that idea and think of that a doctor or a nurse or any healthcare provider could be something other than a white man. We're slowly breaking those ideas down, but maybe we could have permission to go, I can be free of that. I could let that go.
Yeah, wouldn't that be cool?
Yeah. How about the psychology of protests? I mean, that was the whole thing that got this whole discussion started, right?
It was, and then we actually had these great conversations on all this other stuff. What I love, right, is she wrote this in March, and if you read it and then you you go, this is like a crystal ball into the future of what happened. It was literally pandemics, give rise to these feelings and this angst, and then we get confined, and then we have to have this, there's a trigger, and the world can explode in these protests. And it's like, oh my gosh, March 25th happened, and George Floyd's death happened, and it played out almost to the T of how she described it.
Yeah, this whole idea that really everything is fluid, like the world is constantly in flux, but some things are predictable. And she ended up happening to actually do a good job of predicting this is likely to happen.
Yeah.
She wasn't even trying to make a forecast. She was just
no, it wasn't. This is just saying, look, nobody has studied the stages of pandemic, really, right? That when you look at that, there's very little literature out there, and she was surprised by that. She said, "Wow, we've had pandemics or epidemics, forever, and there really hasn't been a lot of research on the psychology of how people respond to those," which in and of itself is a little bit frightening, right? I mean, these do happen. They're major things that impact us across the globe, and we don't really understand our responses to them very well. And hopefully one of the outcomes of this pandemic is that we are actually looking at this, and that we are understanding how we respond, which can help us move forward when the next one comes. And it's not if the next one comes, it's when the next one comes, so that we can respond more appropriately.
Yeah, it is. It's just a matter of time. The one thing in this talk about the protest that I thought was really interesting was this idea of anonymity. And how police, like I think we even referred to the cops as sort of like this RoboCop kind of garb, right?
Yeah.
And that they're more armored up, and their faces are covered and their bodies are covered, and that creates a lack of. It's a dehumanizing thing for the protesters. They don't see individual faces. They don't see cops with human body shapes. They see these RoboCop style humans that are all covered up, and the cops then actually see people who, guess what, are wearing masks and are covered up, and the police are not actually seeing what the protesters look like. They're not really seeing any kind of emotion or anything going on.
Well, and you can apply that too about how you feel about yourself, right? So as a police officer, there's part of this that I'm wearing this costume, and thus it's not me. I'm playing a role, and that role, and however you interpret that role. Same thing for the protesters, that they have this face covering on, which allows them to do things that they normally wouldn't necessarily feel comfortable doing. Thus, you have this perfect storm of all these dehumanizing anonymity type aspects that come to play.
Yeah. It's not good. It's really not a good recipe for keeping things peaceful. It seems to be a recipe that amplifies the possibility for riots.
And as you just mentioned this, and I don't remember the exact video clip, but during the protests and all that time that were going on for those few weeks afterwards, there was one clip that I saw where there was one sheriff who ended up just talking with these protesters who were starting to get more aggressive and various different things, and he ended up just walking with them. And when I think back of that, he was just dressed in a simple police uniform. Full face was out there for everybody. And he was a human. He wasn't a RoboCop. And I think people, just with his element of saying, look, let's look at this together. Let's have this conversation. Let's walk. Let's have, you can peacefully protest. That's part of your right here. But it came across as he's a human. He's understanding us. He's listening to us. And I think that's a lot of there are obviously protesters who just want to be out there and cause havoc and different things. But I think for most protesters, it's about, they want to be heard. They want to have a voice, that this is their way of saying nobody's listening to us and we're tired of it. And this is the way we can get our message across. And so just to have somebody listen.
Yeah, that's the whole thing. And that clip is so vivid to me. I'm really glad that you brought that up. We'll make sure that we link to that in the show notes, because that was just terrific to see that in real time. This very earnest and very open police officer. That was really cool. Kurt, anything else that you want to?
Obviously she talked about public health and that social justice is a health concern. And I think that, again, it seems a little bit of a stretch when you first hear it, but I think there's truth behind that, right? There is this aspect of the systemic kind of injustices that are going on. And we know just from other research about this, the idea of poverty and what that does for health, what mental health, physical health, a number of different pieces of that. And you got to think about all of these other factors that come with injustice and social injustice and the negative impact those have on people's health outcomes. So yeah, it is. I think that's really there. And then the last thing is just, I'm really hopeful. I'm really excited to see this the no COVID task force.
Yeah. With Chris Graves.
Yeah. John Barry, you look at the group of people that are aligned around that. Wow. It's some heavy hitters, some really bright people. And so I'm keeping my fingers crossed and hoping that from that, there's some real actionable, pieces going back to our intro, right? What is changing? And I'm hoping, and again, this is on COVID, which is different than the protests and the Black Lives Matter and social justice piece, but I think they're all combined. And I think there's this aspect that we make progress on one, it'll help in progress on the other. So,
yeah, agreed. Let's just want to tee up, stay tuned for a bonus track coming up in just a second.
Cool.
Hey Groovers, this is Tim with the bonus track and groove idea for the week. First, our conversation with Nicole focused on the increased need for grace and understanding. Rather than trying to convince someone of believing in something that doesn't conform to their pre-existing values, she asks us to extend some curiosity to better understand their position. It reminded us of the peace prayer of St. Francis and the need to think and act as if we were not the center of everything in the universe. Of course, we also spoke about the way the pandemic is first and foremost a public health issue. It is ravaging people around the world, and it doesn't help to politicize it. She also took the opportunity to remind us of the many ways that public health is intertwined with social justice issues. She brought up how public transportation and the availability of a good grocery store in the neighborhood are as much about social justice as they are about public health. While we talked only a little bit about it, Nicole introduced us to the idea of peer permission rather than peer pressure. She heard it on an NPR podcast called Code Switch, and Nicole really connected with it. We wonder if now might be the time when people in power feel like they have permission to make changes to systems that have imposed extra burdens on people of color. Okay, here's your groove idea for the week. Now, I'm going back to my education in Catholic schools, and there were several of them, and I want to remind you of a few lines from the Peace Prayer of St. Francis. It goes in part like this. O Divine Master, grant that I may not so much seek to be consoled as to console, to be understood as to understand, to be loved as to love. So the theme of the prayer is that we should focus more on understanding each other rather than trying to make sure that we are understood. So this week, we'd like to ask you to connect with someone you might not see eye to eye with and focus on understanding them rather than trying to get them to understand you, to console them in their challenges rather than to have them console your wounds. See how it feels, and let us know what you think. That wraps up another episode of Behavioral Grooves, and we hope you've enjoyed our discussion with Nicole. And if you did, please don't hesitate to leave us a good review. We would greatly appreciate it. Go out, have a good week, and keep on grooving.